Hey friends, after posting my last video shooting this CVA Kentucky rifle, I decided to go ahead and pull that drum. As I mentioned in the video, I had a couple of hiccups with my homemade percussion caps. Not that they did not go off, because they did. They just didn't set the powder charge off. Now, what I forgot to mention, in editing it, I didn't put it in to the context, because I'm going to put it in now. A couple of my factory CCI, or excuse me, my Remington number 11 caps did not set the charge off. And obviously that concerned me. And even though I plan on, selling this particular rifle, I wanted to make sure that the ignition would be better than what I experienced out here. So obviously, I removed the drum, and if you're going to do this, you'll want to heat up this portion of the barrel, but not so hot that you expand the metal that is the drum. You just want to expand this metal right here so that it kind of breaks away from the drum. And you want to use something that's got pretty good leverage and a really good jaw. I just use the crescent wrench. It's got a very tight, strong jaw. Once I heated it up to what I needed, just a little bit of pressure and she broke loose. Now, before I go any further with this, I want to explain to you, as I mentioned in the previous video regarding my Cabela's Petrosoli mountain rifle and an issue that I had with it regarding the drum. Now I'm going to get a little close up here and I'm going to kind of walk you through what I was talking about. On that Petrosoli rifle, if you guys can see it very easily, just imagine that this right here is the thickness of your rifle barrel wall. With that Petrosoli, the drum only went in as far as the inside wall of the rifle. So just imagine, because this particular drum goes all the way through the rifle, and this actually touches the wall on the far side of what would be the touch hole and where your powder would drop. So in this particular drum, what's happening is when you're dropping the powder down, that powder has to go in this hole. And if you can imagine looking at this, God, I don't think this is going to show it, but here's your touch hole right here, and this would be the center of the hole that the powder would drop through. So your powder's really got to go from here to here. Or in the worst case scenario, and I'm going to explain it, your fire from your nipple would have to jump from here to here. And that's why I mentioned about wiggling some powder into that touch hole. Now, getting back to my Petrosoli, the drum only came to the inside of the barrel. Now, that particular drum had a straight hole drilled from the touch hole to what would be the inside of, this barrel. So what I did is I took a Dremel tool with a cone in, and I took that straight line, that straight drill, and coned it like this, as far as I could go in to the touch hole or into the drum, if that makes any sense. Let me see if I can't just kind of draw this a little bit. Okay, cut. Okay, I got a couple drawings here, but the one I want to illustrate is this one right here. This was the drum for my Petrosoli. When I pulled it out of the rifle, just imagine these dots right here would be just that straight edge. And your touch hole would be drilled back into this way. And I don't recall how thick that touch hole was, but what I did is I took my Dremel tool and a cone-shaped disc, and I just went into it so that I coned it like this. That got me closer to the source of the ignition, which would be this very crudely drawn nipple. But what that allowed, guys, is when the powder dropped down the barrel, it just didn't stop right here. Some of it filtered in this way closer to the source of ignition. And that solved the problem, with one other little exception. Even after I did that, I had a slight hiccup, and what I did is, after reading an article in Muzzleloader, I drilled a tiny little hole between the nipple and the edge of the barrel. And what that did is that relieved some of that air that was inside of that touch hole. And that cured all my problems. You may or may not experience this, but that's what I did to resolve a slow ignition in that Petrosoli. Now, with this particular CVA rifle, once I took the drum off of the barrel and realized that this hole right here is where the powder dropped. And that's why I suggested, moving it back and forth a little bit to get that powder from here to somewhere closer to the touch hole. Okay? Now, the main issue that I observed is that when I put a bore light where the drum threads in, I put my bore light into that and then looked down the barrel, and what I could observe is a shelf like this. Now, just let me explain that for just a moment. Let me get this better in the camera. That would be the shelf. So when the powder dropped, part of your powder would be prevented from getting into the touch hole because it's sitting on this shelf. Now, what it looks like to me, and I could be wrong, but what it looks like to me is that the breech plug, what I'm looking at is the end of the breech plug. So it looks to me, and I'm just surmising this, is that when they built the gun and they put the drum in position where it needed to be, I believe that that's when they went in and drilled the channel for the gunpowder. Not so much going in right to left, but just what would be the drop. Okay? I know that might be a little, I'm probably not expressing it correctly, but showing it back on this paper plate, looking down the barrel, there's a definite shelf, and this shelf would represent the end of the breech plug. Now, normally you want your powder to drop down the entire barrel and get as close to the source of ignition as one would expect. So, what I did is I took my Dremel tool, and I have a small carbide rotary bit. And imagining what I needed to do to remove some metal, what I did is I opened up this hole in the drum just a little bit, but I favored more towards where the nipple, the cone, would set. And even on the inside of this, I could see the shelf from whatever drilling implement that they used to drill this hole. So, and I'm not quite sure how CVA would have done it back in the day. They probably just threaded this in, dropped some sort of die, because I can't imagine them having a drill as long as this barrel is to center punch this hole. But I'm sure somebody worked out the math either way. But with that being said, I want to show, now I've already opened this up, okay? I've opened this up a little bit. And then what I decided to do was to measure the inside wall and the outside wall of the barrel. So just basically measure the thickness of the barrel, okay? And what I got is 2.15 or thereabouts. Now, taking that number and knowing that the drum has a positive stop right here, I can take my dial calipers, and let me see if I can turn this around and get close, and you can see, hopefully, get into better light. This is not even looking good from my angle, but you can see how much of that hole should be in the barrel, but that's pretty much how thick that shelf is. So what I did is I took my Dremel tool and I opened up the hole closer this way, more this way, and then I kind of beveled it like this, as much as this cutting tool would allow me to do. Okay, so I have that opened up and I have it somewhat coned, but there's still an issue with that inside shelf. So I took the same tool and I did pretty much the same thing. I actually cleaned up the back end of what would be that shelf, which I believe is the end of the breech plug, and then I also worked it this way towards the touch hole, as much as my tool will allow me to do that angle. Now what I have done in looking at it once again with the bore light is let me erase this real quick, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Happy little eraser, looking good. It's not quite straight. Let me color that in. Alright, so basically what I did is, as much as now I was able to reach the back wall, the furthest point, pretty easy. But when I started working towards what would be the the nipple end of the drum, I lost quite a bit of my angle. So what I basically did is I elongated this hole. Okay, so I get rid of this portion of the shelf and a portion of this portion of that shelf, which once again would be the end of the breech plug. Okay, so now when I reassert everything and drop powder down into the barrel, I have all of this room right here to accept more gunpowder, which should help with that ignition problem. Because I actually took a couple more shots off camera with the Magnum percussion caps, and I didn't have any problems whatsoever. So that's telling me, unless you're going to be shooting Magnum caps out of this particular rifle, you may experience some hiccups. And doing what I just did and elongating that channel will allow more powder to drop and get closer to the source of ignition, or where that nipple actually sets. So anyhow, guys, that's all I want to say about that. I'm hoping it fixed the problem. And remember to go back when you install this and put some sort of anti-seize on these threads before reinstalling this into the barrel. And something else that I want to mention now that I think about it, just an afterthought, one of the other issues that I thought may have been part of the hiccup is those of us that have been shooting these guns for a long time, in our pouches of accoutrements, we should have a bottom scraper, okay? Because no matter how much you think you're cleaning the bottom of your barrel, there's always some residual powder left on the bottom that cakes up, and in time that can hinder some of your quick ignition. And I only use my bottom scraper, well, depending on how much I shoot, but it probably once every 2 years. It's not very often, but I will tell you that because of this design, anybody that tries to clean out this barrel with a brush, all you're doing, in essence, is driving all of that soot inside this touch hole right here, because you cannot get to this with a bottom scraper. Now, typically, this side screw is what you would want to unthread and go in there with some sort of pick and clean it out. But as most of us know, these things, these little screws right here, these machine screws, don't typically come out. In fact, you can kind of see this one's been boogered up a little bit. So that was another issue with this, is over the years, the inside of this touch hole was never cleaned out with all of that gunk that you're shoving back down in here. And there again, that would also have hindered some of the powder getting over to the source of ignition. So that's something you might want to keep in mind too. You know, there again, with my flintlock and my Petrosoli, the touch hole is like right at the very, very bottom. So a bottom scraper cleans that right out. But when you're dealing with a drum that actually protrudes all the way across the barrel, that probably is something you might want to keep in mind. And once again, if you have to remove this screw right here, I would recommend first putting some heat, expand that metal, and that screw should come out fairly easy. So anyhow, that's really all I have to say about that. Just something you might want to keep in mind, and I'm pretty much convinced right now that this ignition is pretty much solved, because I've removed enough metal so that that is now a trough, particularly on the underside. So anyhow, thanks for watching, and everybody have a great day. And if you found this informative enough for you, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have a buddy that's having ignition problems with a drum, here's just some suggestions that worked for me over the years. So don't forget to share it with them. Catch you next time around. Bye.